This is lecture 4 from chapter 28, and in this lecture I'll be talking about rondo forms. And you have a handout on rondo forms, which it might be a good idea for you to have out so that you can look at it. Also, you should by now have listened to the Haydn piano sonata movement that's in your anthology. It's anthology number 21. And if you haven't listened to it, I would suggest that you pause the video and go ahead and listen to that movement. I'll be talking about it, but I won't be actually playing you the sound, so it might be a good idea for you to kind of have in your ears what that sounds like. Okay, I'm going to the handout. Okay, a rondo is a form in which a theme with its own well-developed section alternates with contrasting sections. We refer to the theme as a refrain. Sometimes it's called a ritornello, and we refer to the alternating contrasting sections as episodes, or sometimes couplets. Each time the refrain comes back, it comes back in the same key, the main tonic key of the movement. And the episodes are all in contrasting keys. This means that the formal design, the design that's based on themes and when the themes are the same and when they're different, as opposed to the tonal structure, each of those things reinforce each other. So when you have the same formal design, you have the same key. When you have a different theme, you have a different key. You can think of rondo as being an outgrowth of ternary form. Ternary form is an ABA or ABA prime form. And the whole principle of ternary form is that the B section contrasts with the A section in terms of both theme and key. Rondo form basically just adds another episode and another refrain onto the end of ternary form. So a 5-part rondo, instead of being merely ABA, would be A, B, A, C, A. And those A's could be identical to the first refrain, or they could be slightly changed, in which case we'd call them A prime or A double prime. So if you look at the diagram that I've drawn you, a ternary form has a refrain, then episode, then refrain, a statement of a theme, contrasting material, and then restatement of the original theme. And the key that we start in is the main tonic, major 1 or minor 1. For the contrasting material, we go to a new key, or at least a new mode if we keep the same tonic. And then we go back to the same key and the same mode as in the first refrain. In a 5-part rondo, the first 3 sections are the same as in the ternary form, but then we add a new episode C, which also provides contrast with A, and it's in yet another key. And then we go back to the third statement of the refrain, restating the original theme. Typical rondo forms would include this type of 5-part rondo, and also the 7-part rondo that goes ABA, C, ABA. In the Baroque era in particular, there could be other rondo forms that had more different episodes. So we could have a 7-part rondo that was ABA, CA, DA, and perhaps even longer. The 7-part rondo that is symmetrical, that goes ABA, C, ABA, in the classical era is often a hybrid form that combines elements of sonata form with rondo form. We call this sonata rondo form. And you can see the end of this handout for a discussion of sonata rondo form. I'll be talking about that in the next lecture. The final movements of classical era sonatas, of chamber compositions, of symphonies, and of concerti are often rondo forms. The form continued to be used in the 19th century, but it was not as much used as it had been in the Baroque and in the classical era. I think the Romantic composers weren't as big a fan of those many literal repetitions. The example that's discussed in chapter 28 of a 5-part rondo is the Haydn Piano Sonata in D, movement 3, and this is anthology number 21. This rondo is an example of a composite form. Each of the refrains and each of the episodes is a small 2-reprise binary form. You could think of this as being a composite rondo form, a form that's composed of smaller forms. Not all rondo forms will be this neat and well organized with double bars in between all of the sections and with each section being a two reprise binary form. We will see examples of five-part rondos where, apart from some changes in the key signature, there's really no evidence of when you move from one section to the next section. You can take a look at my diagram here of this movement and compare it to Roig Frankoli's diagram of the movement, which is on page 663 of your textbook. So here's the opening section of the rondo form. There should be a repeat sign here. It's just missing, but both the first reprise and the second reprise should be repeated. This is the refrain. It starts in measure 1, it ends in measure 20. As a small rounded binary form, the opening material comes back here in measure 13. So we essentially have a phrase which ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in D. And then the second phrase modulates to A. We have a perfect authentic cadence in A in measure 8. Then we have a lowercase b section, which hints at some other keys, particularly it hints at the key of E minor. Cadence is weakly on A, and we hear this, I believe, as a half cadence in D. And then we go back to the opening material, and we have the first phrase, and then we have the second phrase again. The B music is in D minor, and we have a different idea. We modulate to the relative major with a perfect authentic cadence in F major. We then touch on a few other keys in measures 29 through 33, and then we're back in the original key by measure 34. And then we go back to the original music. And I believe that this music that we have here in measures 41 to 60 is identical to measures 1 through 20. I don't perceive any difference. The C music is in the key of G major. This is a tonic type binary form. We start in G major and we actually end the first reprise in G major. And then there's a little bit of new material here with some additional 16th notes. And then we go back to starting music up until measure 80. You might ask the question, why is this section alone a tonic type? Why does Haydn not choose to modulate in the first reprise as he's done in all the other sections? I believe the answer is that the modulation here would typically be to the dominant of G, which is D, and D is the main tonic key. I think he's saving the main tonic key for the final appearance of the refrain, and he doesn't want to anticipate it by going to it too early. Following the G major music, we have what's called a retransition. This is the retransition. It starts in measure 81 and it goes to measure 93. We've been in the key of G, we briefly tonicize E, and then through a sequence return to D major. And then we have an arrival on A major, which we now perceive as the dominant of D. And then we have a dominant prolongation with just A440s alternating in the music and becoming sparser and sparser until we bring in that opening music, the refrain. I think this is a somewhat humorous and intentionally somewhat humorous retransition that leads us inevitably back to D major. You might have noticed when you listened to it that this final refrain doesn't have any repeat signs. It appears to be on paper twice as long as the others, but that's because the repeat signs have now been turned into a written out variation of the music. So we have the first reprise here, and then we have a variation of the first reprise, another 8 measures with additional 16th note motion in the left hand. Now we go on to the second reprise. This is all the second reprise. And instead of encountering a repeat sign here, we now have the second reprise written out. And we land on the D chord here, and then just for good measure, we have an extra bar of D major chords to round off the form. That's how a rondo form works in the classical era, and it's basically how the rondo form works in any classical music. We will next be discussing the sonata rondo in the final video for chapter 28.